From mysterious Mind Flayers to the final battle for Hawkins, here's everything that went into making Stranger Things Season 5 the epic conclusion fans have been waiting for. Let's start with Noah Schnapp, because Will Byers has been through so much throughout this entire series, and in Volume 2 he really gets his moment to shine. Noah talks about how Will has been dealing with this internal struggle throughout the entire season, about whether he's good or evil, whether he's a superhero or a monster. You can see it in every scene where Will looks at his hands or questions himself. Noah had to tap into something really deep for these episodes, especially when Will is basically possessed by Vecna and has to channel this dark energy. He says he had to let down a lot of walls and just unleash this beast within him, which is pretty intense when you think about it. This is the same kid who started the show as this gentle, artistic character who just wanted to play Dungeons and Dragons with his friends. What's really cool is that Frank Darabont, who directed some of these episodes and is obviously a legendary filmmaker, talks about how once you make actors feel safe, you get fearless performing. And that's exactly what happened with Noah. He went all the way with it, completely committed to these moments where he's channeling Vecna's power. There's this scene where Will is able to enter Vecna's mind and literally break his leg from the inside. And Noah had to act like Vecna, embody this villain and monster, and speak through him. He says he felt like he had to unleash a beast within himself, which must have been such a weird headspace to get into, especially after playing this vulnerable character for so long. And can we talk about the practical effects for a second? Barry Gower, who's the head of the makeup effects department, got a phone call saying they needed to build a real demogorgon, like an actual physical demogorgon that the actors could interact with. He says he could almost hear his crew screaming behind him because this was such a massive undertaking. They used digital technology from the visual effects team, got the 3D file of an 8-foot-tall demogorgon, 3D printed it, molded it, and cast it in silicone. And when you watch those scenes where they're trying to revive the dead demogorgons with heat, that's an actual physical creature they built. The attention to detail is insane. Now let's talk about Kaylee, because bringing Linnea Berthelsen back was something the Duffer Brothers had wanted to do since Season 2. They had a lot of ideas for her character that they weren't able to explore back then, so they finally found the perfect place for her in this final season. And Linnea talks about how this is almost a completely different character from who we met before. In Season 2, Kali was all about being in control, controlling her own look, her own narrative, her own destiny. But in Season 5, she loses everything. She's not in control anymore, and that shift must have been really interesting to play. The most intense moment for Linnea was probably the head shaving scene. She actually asked Matt and Ross if she could do the head shave on camera, and then they got so excited about it that they wrote it directly into the script. The person who shaved her head was Bryn Berg, who's the co-department head of hair, and they had to do it in one take. The set was apparently so quiet you could hear a pin drop while this was happening. Bryn had to know exactly how each step would go with the buzz, and then the shears, and how everything would fall. And Linnea was crying softly during the scene, which was probably both acting and genuine emotion because she's literally watching her hair fall away. When they called cut, the entire crew applauded. That must have been such a powerful moment. Speaking of intense scenes, we need to discuss the Jonathan and Nancy melting room sequence because the behind-the-scenes work on that is absolutely bonkers. Chris Trujillo, the production designer, talks about how one of the most difficult concepts they had to figure out was making Hawkins' lab look like it was melting from the top down. They'd never sculpted anything quite like that at that scale before. They wanted it to feel organic but also supernatural, which is a tough balance to strike. Mark Hawker, the special effects coordinator, reveals they had 3,000-gallon tanks of goo, and they had about 1,500 feet of piping going around the set just to deliver it on cue. There were 30 of these mechanisms all the way around the set, and once you pull them open, they fill these troughs that have a little slit in the front, and that's where the goo flows down the walls. They couldn't keep it running constantly because it would fill up the set and the bottom needed to be at a certain level. So it was this whole choreographed thing where Sean Levy calls action, they turn everything on, it starts pouring, they call cut, and they turn it off. Charlie Heaton and Natalia Dyer talk about how they had no idea what they were getting into. They were told it was going to be a melty scene, and that's about it. But what makes this scene so special is that it was the last scene they shot together as Jonathan and Nancy. They spent about a month just mechanically going through the scene beat by beat, so they knew it so well they didn't have to think about it anymore. That way, on the day, they could focus on just being honest with each other and connecting emotionally. Natalia says these were some of her favorite days she's had filming, even though they were soaking wet and freezing. There's something about being physically challenged that adds to the energy of a scene. which makes total sense when you watch it. Amy Paris from the costume department talks about how this was probably one of the harder things she'd had to do on the show, because nobody's ever been in a melty goo room before. They did many tests with special effects, trying to figure out what kind of paint would stick longer, and then they'd have to flake it off. Between takes, the hair and makeup artist had to rush in with color bottles of the goo and spray it onto the actor's hair. Sean Levy talks about how episode 6 in particular was unique because there's so much engine behind it. From the very beginning, when he first read it, even in outline form, he was like, well, he doesn't know what poor sucker of a director is going to handle that one because there are like 5 different action sequences. But what's even more exceptional is that it also has truly great character scenes. That's the magic of Stranger Things, right? It balances these massive action set pieces with really intimate, emotional moments between characters we've grown to love. The Steve and Dustin fight scene is a perfect example of that balance. Joe Keery talks about how the Stunts team had a fight sequence planned out, and he and Gayton looked at it and said, okay, this is a great base, but now we need to clarify the acting intention behind it. It's not just about the physical choreography, it's about what these characters are actually feeling. Joe mentions how fun it was to work with Gayton on this because they have done so much dialogue together over the years, but Gayton's a young man now, so he was really up for the physical, demanding stunt work. Gatton, on his end, talks about how this was one part of the season he'd been both anticipating and dreading. There was a lot of pressure on him because so many people are invested in the relationship between Steve and Dustin, just as much as the actors themselves are. He thinks it's going to be a tough watch for people who really love their dynamic. But he also says it was really fun to dig into with Joe, and it felt like something that had been earned over a long time of fun banter in a season where they're consistently at odds. It's this needed moment where they can actually verbally express to each other what they've wanted to say for a long time, where those boundaries break down. The hospital sequence with the demodogs attacking is another showcase of practical effects meeting action choreography. Maya Hawke talks about how all of her work at the hospital was extremely fun, and she loved doing it with Amy Beth McNulty, who plays Vicky. Maya mentions how beautiful it is that you have these two couples, but one couple doesn't know the other two people are a couple. The explosion in the laundry room was done with all practical effects too. Mark Hawker explains the set was inside a practical location in a real building, so everything they did was high-pressure air blasts. You see all that debris coming out? All practical effects. No CGI explosions, just good old-fashioned movie magic with air cannons and carefully placed debris. And then Karen Wheeler gets her hero moment. Cara Buono talks about her favorite stage direction ever in a script, which was just Karen Wheeler. At the table read, when they got to that part, the entire cast erupted in applause and cheers. Millie Bobby Brown was yelling "yeah" from across the table. Cara says she hadn't really acted with the other cast in this capacity before, where she was part of the action. She was doing push-ups in costume before takes to get pumped up. She describes it as the ultimate inner kid in her who's pretending and gets to play, and it's like someone created this thing for her to play in. The hero music kicks in, she pushes open those doors through the smoke, and you can see in the behind-the-scenes footage how much the other cast members were blown away by it. Amy Beth says Cara is the coolest woman in the whole world, and Maya talks about how awesome Karen's journey is this season. The Max and Holly cave memory sequence required Sadie Sink and Nell Fisher to really trust each other and the material. Sadie talks about how the writing was so good and Nell's performance was so good that their moment together is really special. Max has had such an intense journey with Holly, and to pause at such a climactic point and have Max give Holly this pep talk about being heroic, it meant a lot to Sadie. You can see in the behind-the-scenes footage Sadie running through these vine structures on blue screen sets, and she's giving it everything she's got. The physical demands of these scenes are no joke. When we get to episode 7, Ross Duffer explains it's traditional in the sense that characters are reuniting and developing a plan. But Matt Duffer adds it's less action-heavy and more emotional than most episodes. Sean Levy describes it as a pivot point towards the endgame, which is exactly what it feels like when you watch it. The Max waking up scene is incredibly emotional, and Caleb McLaughlin talks about how right before they filmed it, Sean called action and the energy completely switched and changed. He looked into Sadie's eyes, and when they finished the scene, everyone was quiet. The crew was quiet, then Maya and Amy Beth started crying. Then Sadie started crying, then Caleb started crying. You can see in the footage how everyone just embraced after that take, and the crew applauded. Caleb says everyone felt the presence of what they brought to the table. Maya Hawke describes it perfectly when she says, "Every now and then as an actor, a spell is cast in the room." And that day, the spell was cast. She went home feeling so inspired. That's what happens when you get talented people who've worked together for years, who genuinely care about these characters and each other. And you give them material that's this emotionally rich. Magic happens. The Pain Tree set where Holly wakes up captured by Vecna is another masterpiece of production design. Michael Mayer, who's the second unit director and VFX art director, talks about how they wanted to design something that had these arachnid characteristics but also looked like an extension of Vecna himself. The sculptural base is foam, and then the scenic department experimented endlessly with different materials, layering them, stretching them, pulling them, adding slime and web-like materials. The level of detail is mind-boggling, as Jamie Campbell Bower points out. He talks about how when you have a set that big, you want to be able to walk onto it and feel like you own the space. And that's exactly what he did when he was lowered on wires onto the set in full Vecna prosthetics. It was nice for him to feel like, this is my home, this is where I'm residing. But the most emotionally resonant part of episode 7, and maybe the entire volume, is Will's coming out scene. This is something the Duffer brothers have been building to for a very long time. Matt Duffer talks about how it's important that Will comes to terms with this, and once he's able to do that, he's heading into the final battle with a confidence and maturity he hasn't had before. Noah Schnapp reveals that from season 1, if you look in the lookbook, it says Will felt different and is queer, and it's always been there. But the Duffers really took their time with that storyline and arc, didn't rush it, didn't push it in anyone's face. That's what makes it so real, because it's not his whole story. There's the struggles of his dad leaving, his mom who struggled with drinking, the traumas of being stuck in the upside down, his friends growing up faster than he is. There are so many layers that make this character real and authentic. Noah prepared for this scene intensely. He read it every morning and every night for the month leading up to filming. That allowed him on the day to completely forget about the script, forget about remembering his lines, and just let it pour out of him. He could focus on tapping into that feeling and emotion, and the words would spill out on top of that feeling. Winona Ryder talks about how Noah blew her away this season, how he had a lot to do, and it was beautiful work, incredible to witness. When the scene was done, the whole cast got up and applauded, which Noah says he'd never experienced before in that set. It was a really special moment he'll never forget, and he's so glad he had the whole cast there to watch and support him and experience it with him. What makes this even more meaningful is that Noah mentions most of the cast found out about him personally through news headlines, and he always felt like he missed out on that chance to really sit them down and tell them. Filming this scene actually helped him feel more comfortable in that part of himself with them. You can see in the footage how Gaten, Caleb, and Charlie all embrace him in a group hug after they finish filming. It's this beautiful full circle moment. But when it comes to the massive finale battle, the Duffer brothers explained that one of their main goals was to make sure every character had something very specific to do. The only way to defeat Vecna, the only way to defeat the Mind Flayer, would be if everyone contributed in some meaningful way. The Mind Flayer design itself was a massive undertaking. Michael Marr, who's the second unit director and VFX art director, knew he was going to have a big role in figuring out the look development for all of this and essentially making a whole new creature. Matt Duffer explains that very early on in the writer's room, they decided they wanted Vecna to have some sort of lair in this abyss, which led to the idea of a fleshy tree. The Mind Flayer was specifically designed around everything that Vecna embodies, so there's the viney upside down stuff, sharp teeth and claw-like protrusions, and the trick was to kind of bury the monster within. If they did their jobs right, it would be hidden as a monster. It looks like a tree, like some castle. It doesn't tip their hat yet. And then the columns where the kids are embedded are basically like rib structures, and everything sort of points to Vecna. The physical construction process for the Pain Tree set was 5+ months. The sculptural base is foam, and Alex Sherrod and his sculpture team did a breathtaking job bringing Michael's incredible drawings to life. Each of those columns is 20+ feet tall with an internal structure of steel. The dimension in the surfaces is so real and has such an organic quality to it. Chris Trujillo calls it one of his favorite sets from the season from a purely aesthetic perspective, and says it's a testament to the Duffer brothers for really caring about having a real physical set whenever possible. For the exterior abyss battle, the team found this beautiful canyon in New Mexico that they wanted to shoot at. but it was protected. Betsy Patterson, the VFX supervisor, explains they were able to send just some data collection people who photographed every inch of it, scanned it, and had LiDAR drones fly over the top. They took all of that inspiration and translated it into their exterior abyss, which they built in this huge quarry on the edge of the greater Atlanta area. Chris Trujillo says his sculpture department, led by Alex Sherrod, cranked this set out in 3 weeks, which was just an unbelievable undertaking. Because the Mind Flayer monster is unimaginably huge in scale, it was very hard for the actors to wrap their heads around just how big it is. Weta Visual Effects in New Zealand sent out an iPad that had an accurate 3D model of what the Mind Flayer would look like. Using augmented reality, they were able to place that creature in the real world through the iPad. Charlie Heaton explains that wherever they pointed the iPad in the space would be roughly what they were seeing of this monster. You can see Finn Wolfhard holding the iPad up and showing the monster to the rest of the cast, and the Duffers were so excited about this monster. The dust effects for the monster's legs hitting the ground were achieved with these crazy rigs. Nick Muller, the Steadicam operator, explains that as these legs hit the ground, they had to time camera shakes to give vibrations. Gotten remembers they had a dust rig that would make a pop sound, like a blast of air on a pile of dust that was settled right below it, right where the legs were going to drop. Caleb says it felt cool, like they were making a war movie. There was a lot of running on sand and rocks, and Natalia mentions they had these giant jeeps with cameras on them, and you're just chasing after the jeep as fast as you can. Gotten's legs were absolutely fried from all the cardio. Caleb and Gaten have this hilarious moment in the behind-the-scenes footage where they're talking about a stunt where Lucas tackles Dustin to save him from a massive claw. Gotten jokes that they grappled, and he wrapped his legs sensually around Caleb's waist and they rolled in the sand. Caleb laughs and says that's the closest they've ever got, and Gotten adds that they embraced gracefully. Their chemistry is so genuine even when they're just goofing around. The flamethrower scenes were particularly funny to film. Charlie Heaton admits that obviously it's not a real flamethrower, and unlike with a gun where you can cheat recoil and have a trigger and get the idea of what it would be like, a flamethrower when it's on doesn't actually do anything. It's just this steady thing. So being like, yeah, while holding something that does nothing was hilarious to him. The costumes for the final battle were designed to feel realistic. Amy Paris, the costume designer, explains it was about what it feels like a kid would do to battle a monster. Like, if you've got this, I've got that, do you have that? They used Eddie Munson's weapons for the final battle, which felt like a cool symbolic moment. Mike has these riveted knee pads that he would have made and stitched up himself. Lucas has a little epaulette made of chainmail to help make him feel more powerful. And Nancy's got her pushed up sleeves, her vest from season 4 with room for shotgun shells, and her gloves because she's a badass. Speaking of Nancy, her main inspiration for the season was Sigourney Weaver in Alien, and Bryn Berg, the hair department head, says it took this long to get there. Shooting the finale scene was like the pinnacle for her. Nancy also had to crawl through a gross portal, and Mark Hawker explains that construction built a steel box so nothing would collapse in, with tearaway membranes made of a very specific type of silicone designed to rip when you start pushing through it. Natalia says it was stretchy and was bouncy, and the hardest part was actually ripping through it. The slime effects when Steve and Dustin are smashing eggs under the Mind Flayer were achieved with a methacel base, which is like a food additive that's in shakes and stuff. The grosser the better. Gatton talks about how it's so heavy and all the sludge would catch into his ghillie suit, so it felt like he was carrying a bucket of sludge with him. Caleb confirms he had it really slimy and nasty. The 11 versus Vecna sequence was huge. Hiro Koda, the stunt coordinator, explains there's a whole different approach when someone has superpowers. It made the wires a lot more fun because they could go way beyond what is natural. John L. Kerfman says it was important to capture the history between Vecna and 11. Hiro created this beautiful wire sequence between them where it's just the push and the pull and the back and the forth. Jamie Campbell Bower was a rock star, riding those wires all day. One of the hardest things Millie did was when she tries to leap over Vecna. She has to catch herself and sort of flip around and act caught. Ross gives a special shout out to Cece, Millie's stunt double, who did the most incredible stunts he's ever seen in the history of the show. There were also 300 vortex lights hung so that as the Mind Flayer moves, you have this soft but directional light that dances around the set and creates moving shadows. The funniest thing is that the stage didn't actually move during the Mind Flayer battle. Jamie remembers when somebody described it to him. He was like, "Oh, great, so the stage is gonna move?" And they said, "No, you're just gonna have to act it." He was terrified. So they literally stood there, and when the creature starts to move, they had to throw themselves against one side. Jamie says it felt like they were on a 1970s version of Star Trek, like Shatner going, "I'm having to sway around." The camera operators had to grab the wheels and shake the thing to make it feel like an earthquake. Millie was so committed that there's a take where she throws herself into a pillar and a look of pain comes across her face. Matt Duffer comes over the god mic to ask if she's okay, and she immediately breaks into a smile because she was acting. She totally fooled them and was so proud of herself. Ross explains that the biggest challenge was giving Will a big moment because they've been building to this whole year where he's able to really hurt Vecna. That's why they have Will coming back with his powers and really saving Eleven, giving her the moment where she's able to do the knockout blow. Hiro Koda says the Duffers were like, "Hey, let's just take Vecna's arm off completely," which was a really cool moment because Will and Eleven were kind of working together when they're not even together. The scene ends with Vecna being impaled on one of these big spikes, and Mike McCash explains that Jamie had to be rigged up to this spike that had the tip taken off, which they added back in post, protruding from his chest. There's blood shooting out of his mouth, and there was a discussion about what color Vecna's blood is. It's not red, it's not completely black. It's a special maroon black. Noah Schnapp was always curious how they were going to write the ending of who would really defeat Vecna, and he thinks it was so fitting that it was Joyce. It's very reminiscent of Season 1 and very full circle. Matt Duffer agrees that if anyone has been pained by this monster, it was Joyce, so it was really satisfying to see Winona wield that axe one more time and actually properly use it. The Duffers had been very careful about not using the F word in the show. They knew they wanted to save it for a very specific moment. Early on, they knew it had to be right before Vecna is killed, and then they gave it to Winona. It felt just right. "You f***ed with the wrong family" is such a perfect line. Jamie's final moments as Vecna are surprisingly human. As he's coughing up this bile, the feeling he wants to convey is just, "Please don't." It was one of the more human moments of playing the character. Barry Gower says they've got so many great memories, and they feel very lucky to have been part of designing an iconic character. It was something really special that they all accomplished. It's sad that chapter's finally over now. When they called cut on Jamie's final scene, Millie hugged him in full Vecna suit, and the crew applauded. Jamie says having that connection with Millie is always going to be the lasting memory he has from the show. To be with such a beautiful, shining, loving person is the thing he'll be most grateful for. Sean Levy puts it beautifully when he says they brought something into the world with Stranger Things, and now all these years later, to be bringing these experiences to a close is very bittersweet. That experience of directing these actors is done, but the thing they made is forever. Caleb says that even back at these moments, it was so recent that it feels like they're still doing it. He thinks in 5 or 10 years it's gonna hit differently, like whoa, they're really not doing the show anymore. He valued all these moments. Gayton says it was like the gang's Everest. Probably the most difficult stretch they had all year, but very fun. And that's really what comes through in all of this behind-the-scenes footage. Yes, it was hard. Yes, they were exhausted and covered in goo and running on sand until their legs gave out. But they were doing it together after 9 years of growing up on the show, and they gave it absolutely everything they had. A new intro. After this line, it's this beautiful full circle moment.